Yo. What's up? I am gonna stream S.t.a.l.k.e.r 2 again. For about 2 hours. Just getting my XP in. It's December 18th. Dang, I wish I could. Hold up. Well, I thought I could play, but it wants me to do an update, so that's fun. Okay, it's done. But yeah, it's December 18th. Quarter 4 is pretty much over. Pretty much done with business. So I'm going to spend a lot of time for the rest of this month and the beginning of next month working on music. Final Focus, check me out at Final Focus Music or www.finalfoc.us. It spells Final Focus, but instead of .com it's .us, the last 2 letters of focus. We're just loading the game now. I guess I could go on a rant full screen. I got this new chair. This is a birthday gift from my, I don't know, my girlfriend? I don't know, she's a girl, she's my friend. Stuff like that happens. Any feedback on the camera style? I still like this camera style. Maybe there's too much stuff on the screen, I don't know. But I like the face tracking and all that stuff. It's cool, it's high tech. And I programmed these cool switcher features with the camera so I can do that stuff. It's fun. I like it. I use Stream Deck. I use Companion. Suddenly my okay. Suddenly the right speaker works. Okay, we're back. We're ready to go. So I just opened up part of the rest of the map. I went to the sphere. I found Solder. I didn't kill him. He had a scanner of mine or of one of the commanders from Zalicia. I don't know if that guy's some kind of... I don't know what his rank is, you know? But... man, I would really like to press any key. There we go. And then... I'm a decent visitor. Let's see if I can upgrade it, I think. I like his fit. Let's repair the old gas mask. All these guns are great, so I'm just gonna... Alright, so we're all back in order. Man, I had a really good session last night that I should have streamed because it was like the finale of the Lesser Zone. I shot so many dudes and I didn't die. Alright, so I get to leave the Lesser Zone, which is cool.
Батя, прийом. Це Маляр. Зото, виявляється, не збрехав. На КПП схід чисто. Тому я буду рухатися в бік кордону, нарешті. А звідти вже на затон до Бороди.
How does it show...
Сподіваюся, його там ще не втопили в болоті.
I wish it would show how many bullets I have, because I know it's not 80. And what is this, buckshot? I don't need buckshot. Let me sell some stuff to Hamster before I leave.
А от і мій улюблений клієнт.
What's new around the zone? I don't care.
Для тебе
I'm leaving the
найкращі
zone.
ціни.
The lesser
Зоною
zone.
клянуся.
I don't know why everybody's obsessed with zone. They're like, zone, 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 zone. I don't think I can shoot 9 by 19. 9 by 18. And then shotgun shells I don't need. I don't need this second suit. I really don't need all these why do I have all these PDAs? I wish I knew about that. Gaffer's PDA, Max, Saturdays. I don't need this. Hopefully selling this isn't a problem. If I sell all of them, does it matter? It must be okay. Okay. I can't sell these two. Okay. And what do you have that I want? I don't understand exactly. How do I know how much ammo I have? It says 80, and this says 4. That can't be right. So let me check.
Заглядай. Притримаю для тебе найкраще.
Cool it with all the small talk, buddy. Oh, I have to go into another. Don't be suspicious. Alright, so it is 80. And that is 3. 5. There's a dead guy here. What the fuck? Why are there so many dead guys? That ain't right. What's up with all the dead guys, my dudes? Any more dead guys? I've got more stuff for you.
А от і мій улюблений клієнт.
Ward is clearing the area. Wonder what that means.
Для тебе найкращі ціни. Зоною клянуся.
I can't sell it because it's broken. Fuck. Alright, give me all of your 9 by 18s. No, not all of them. I want... Give me another 60 of these, and then and then whatever else, and yeah. And then, do I have enough of everything else? I think so. Just, I'll get rid of that. Maybe,
Заглядай. Притримаю для тебе найкраще.
Look at all this broken shit. I have this one too. But what a... Oh. Yeah, unload. Why can't I take that? Yeah, I have to unload these first before I put them away. So that shows that I have ammo in here. That one I wanna... This is a nice gun that I wish I could fix. So... I just have 2 of these? Okay, I thought I had to unload it. Whatever. There's so many busted guns. I want to see if I can take this to get it repaired. But yeah, so it's December 18th. Last week was my birthday. 37 years old. What else is 37 years old? Maybe the Nintendo. Hey, I know you, Mastiff. Yeah, you... Yeah. Yeah, it was really sad when that happened. They almost turned you into a zombie, my dude. Ah, I appreciate it. He's gonna give me a stash. Because he's not going out anytime soon. I found this guy in a cabin. There's these guys called the Monolith. I don't know if they're like slightly demonic. But this guy was levitating, and then a bunch of stalkers came to meet him out front, and I ended up having to kill all of them. Which, you know, wasn't very fun. Thanks, buddy. Okay. This one cost $10,000 to repair, and I don't have that. But I'm gonna take this with me to the next hideout, to the next store. Dude, Lens, it's been a lot of fun. Who knows if I'll see you again. You have no leg. Good luck getting out of the ward. Bye. You don't need a gun. Why are you doing that?
Що, як? Сало. Тобі як завжди?
Let's see if you got any work for me.
Шукаю. Запропонувати щось можеш.
Не повіриш. Свіжаки все розуміють.
Ah, okay. You only had one job for me. Alright, fair enough. Alright, we're gonna go make our way. Dang, I should have eaten before I started this. You might see me snacking. Okay, let's... Alright, we're gonna put on this video. Is the West in decline? C. Miller, Idris, Yanis Varoufakis, and Konstantin Kisin. This is gonna be an interesting debate. Yep, so you can like disable some anomalies with the bolts. I think this video is going, it's just on a holding slide. I've been here before. I think there's an anomaly in this shed. Yep, it's a very pretty game, you know? Oh, okay. So I might be able to jump through it. Is that how it works? Hell yeah. Didn't do all that for nothing? Nope. That'd be a stash. That's why I did that. I'm learning. Alright, here we go.
Dear guests, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you, the audience here in the University Ola in Bergen, Norway, as well as the viewers around the world, to the Holberg Debate 2024.
Jürgen.
My name is Jürgen S.t.a.l.k.e.r, and I am the chair of
That's
the board of the
Norwegian
Holberg
for
Prize.
George.
The Holberg Prize is one of the largest international prizes awarded to outstanding scholars in the humanities, social sciences, law and theology. The prize was established by the Norwegian government in 2003 in homage to the 18th century scholar and writer Ludvig Holberg. In addition to the academic events that are held in June each year, in celebration of the Holberg Prize laureate, the Holberg Debate is held annually in December in the spirit of the intellectual curiosity and societal engagement.
I'm good.
The Holberg Debate aims to engage prominent scholars, as well as non-academics, in public debate on pressing issues of our time. The title of this year's debate is the question.
I don't need that pistol.
Is the West
I need these bullets
in
though.
decline? On the panel, we are very proud to present Professor Cynthia Miller-Idris, Professor Yanis Varoufakis, and
Varoufakis is a communist.
Kisin. They will all be probably
Konstantin Kisin was from
introduced
Russia,
shortly.
and he's like a
But for
libertarian.
now, let me extend a warm welcome to all of you.
So
Thank you for coming here.
always funny to listen to a communist argue with a libertarian. It's funny.
We are also very pleased indeed to have with us British journalist Sarah Montague as moderator of this event. Sarah Montague has presented many of the BBC's most popular radio and TV programs, including Hard Talk, Today, and The World at One. Before joining
You wanna
the
beat
BBC,
me next
Montague
time,
worked
buy
at
American. Who
British
said that?
Television and Sky News. Over a number of years,
Like a
she
Batman.
also presented BBC World's Noble Minds, a discussion between Nobel laureates on global issues. Montague holds the honorary degrees Doctor of Letters from the University of Sussex and Doctor of Laws from the University of Bristol. We are truly honored to have you with us. So please, Sarah, the floor is yours.
All right, so we got our first speaker. It's gonna be a chick. I'm not sexist, but usually they just don't stand their ground against communists
Welcome
and
to the Holberg debate. It is
fascists.
a privilege to be moderating
libertarians.
the debate here today at the university in the beautiful city of Bergen. Not only because we have a stellar cast, but the subject is one that is central to all our futures, is the West in decline. Now, if we're only talking about relative decline because other parts of the world are becoming richer and ideally more democratic, then perhaps we could be happy about that. But if decline means
democracy
that we
good?
become poorer, our democracies are
Is
under
wealth
threat,
good?
our culture is eroded, and our choices for how we want to live our lives are limited, then I suspect we'd all want to find ways to address that. And I'm assuming, of course, that as we're
Why they get
debating
coupons?
here in Bergen, that we, for the purpose of our debate, are Western. Now, you'll know that we're considering this question because of the obvious pressures
Shit,
and
where's Richter?
crises that are facing the Western world.
Damn, I was supposed to get back to
Living
Zalicia.
standards. No longer the case that our children can expect to be wealthier than us, nor indeed live longer than us. Take the rise of China and its lending support to Russia and other BRIC nations. In a multipolar world, what happens to Western influence?
Oh, multipolar world, huh?
Take the pressure on our democracies from
That's,
populism,
Dugan.
disinformation, and social fragmentation. The leader of the free world, the USA, is deeply divided.
No, we're
And
not.
love him or hate him, we are buckling up for the roller coaster ride that will be the second Trump
All right, I'm gonna get back to
presidency.
Zalicia.
Or take war in the Middle East, famine in Sudan, the invasion of Ukraine, all of which the West seems unable or unwilling to prevent. Not to mention, of course, we seem increasingly damaged by the warming planet, which, if we can't address, could accelerate any decline. It's a rather terrible list. But, and there are some really significant buts in this debate. There are some remarkable positives. People are now better educated. We live in remarkably innovative societies at a time of rapid technological change. And democracy has been a remarkably resilient system. And of course, if
Democracy?
your fear is a physical threat, then
I don't know how
Western
resilient
nations
it
are
is.
now rapidly raising their defense spending. That's the backdrop. Let's get going on the debate itself. Now, I should say that if you want to be more directly involved in this debate, you can do. You can go to the website holbergprize.org and send a question in. I shall be casting my eye across them and feeding them into the debate, perhaps picking up a few at the end. And that debate will start shortly, but first we are going to have some
Get to it.
presentations from each of our panelists. So let me introduce them, all three of them first, then we'll get them one by one up on the stage. Yanis Varoufakis almost needs no introduction. Leads Mera25 in Greece, co-founder of the pan-European movement DM25. He's an academic economist. He was Greece's finance minister in 2015 when he sort of burst onto the global stage.
Is that before or after the
Absolutely brilliant
collapse
interviewee,
of
always good fun to interview.
the Greek economy?
Author of
That's a good
best-selling
question.
books, among them Techno-Feudalism, Talking to My Daughter, and The Weak Suffer What They Must. He, of course, is the undoubted left-winger on our panel. Konstantin Kisin
He's
became
the
famous
communist.
for his
Now he's still
defense of
left
free speech. He's a Sunday Times best-selling author, comedian, satirist, social commentator, and of course host of Trigonometry. Born in the Soviet Union, raised in Britain, he wrote An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, and he's talked widely on topics such as tolerance, cancel culture, immigration, and multiculturalism. And finally, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idris, professor in the School of Public Affairs and School of Education at the American University in Washington. Much of her research is around the prevention of hate-fueled violence, which is why she was involved in founding what's called PERIL. It's the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. She's testified regularly in front of the US Congress and written books, among them.
I'm investing in
perhaps most
Bitcoin
famous,
so I can go
Hate
to
in the Homeland,
American University and
New
finish my
Global
degree.
Father. So let's start with Cynthia. Would you like to take the stage, Cynthia? The floor is yours for a while, and then I'll hop back up.
But I'm going to switch majors because fuck business administration.
Thank you all. I want to thank the Holberg Prize
Although
Committee,
making
the
money is always good.
organization, for hosting us, for having us, the university for having us here, my fellow panelists, for whom it's a real honor for me to be on
What do you
the
think of
stage
her,
with you
chap?
both, and Sarah for moderating this debate as well. I thought, since I go first, I might start with a bit of a definition of what the West is, since I know some questions exist about that. How do we define it? How do we understand it? We may not all agree on that. To some extent, it's usually used to refer geographically to Western Europe, North America, New Zealand,
No, it means democratic.
Australia. But then,
Capitalist.
of course, there's contested countries that straddle Eastern Europe, Turkey, Mexico, sometimes
Western
referred to
is
as
a
part of the West
style,
as well,
it's a
sometimes
theme.
not, because they fit
It's
in other
not
regions.
geography
But
because
I think
location
what
is
we're really
relative.
here to debate today is not the geography, but what's usually associated with those geographies, which are something sort of distinct culturally, politically, economically, a set of norms, values, and principles that have historically included things like democracy, I'm sure we'll talk about that, capitalism, I know we'll talk about that, individualism, liberty, equality, the
Techno-feudalist's
safeguarding of
favorite
human
system.
rights, the belief in scientific or rational knowledge over superstition and conspiracies, which is what I will focus on today,
Where's your guy?
and the protection of the rule of law. All of that, in theory, has been guided by a Western principle of universalism, which means that all those ideals, individualism, liberty, equality, and human rights, are supposed to apply to everyone, all human beings without exception. But of course, that's the rub. That principle of universalism, the one that should be a liberating and equalizing force, has also helped perpetuate some of the most vile hierarchies of superiority and inferiority and human rights abuses in history, as Western explorers, leaders, and powers have sought to control, exploit, and conquer huge swaths of the globe in the name of a supposedly universally preferable and superior system. I'm not saying that other civilizations or regions of the world have not done horrific things. They have. The abuses of slavery, conquests, wars, genocides, the brutality of patriarchy itself is
Where's
by
the
no
guy?
means a Western innovation or an exception. But the messianic colonialist effort to spread its principles and norms universally, often through force, is a distinguishing feature of the West, even if it's not
Where's your
a
boss?
unique one. And the increasing backlash we've seen within Western democracies against minorities and women who are simply asserting their claims to those universal rights and principles, their ability to participate in it. Backlash in the form of rising hate crimes, white supremacist extremism, the kinds of things that I study, spikes in misogyny, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hate, and in the form of a dismissal
I just
of
hope that
complaints
she
from minorities
studies
and women.
all the forms of hate, not
That
just
those
white
complaints
supremacy.
come from overly woke, triggered snowflakes who don't know
That
real
is
hardships.
guy.
Dismissals that notably almost always come from white men is striking, and it raises the question of whether those principles and norms were ever really intended to be universal. Or were they simply a fig leaf used to justify colonial expansion and external pillaging and internal hierarchies that secured the dominance of white men? The growing disillusionment of those inside and outside the West who look at these contradictions
Oh, it
and
says
see
it's
at
completed.
best a set of
Fuck.
founding principles and norms that have
I
gone
didn't give it to
awry,
Victor.
and at worst ones that are working as intended, is understandably intense.
Well, that was annoying.
So I would argue that it's the West's inability to reconcile those contradictions, the incomplete fulfillment of so many promises of liberty and equality, the tension between universalism's ambitions and its reality, that's left us so vulnerable to the multiple threats we face today, most of which I think come from within, and I suspect we're going to hear that from my fellow panelists too.
Hamstring salsa stuff.
So is the West thus defined in decline? And if so, is it reversible? To answer the first question,
is the West in
by all accounts,
decline?
it's pretty clear that the West is in decline, or at the very least is in the midst of a protracted existential crisis.
We
No
defeated
democracy
Hitler
across the West
and
could
the
currently be
Soviet Union,
described
and now
as
we're like-
thriving. We have rising authoritarianism, xenophobia, terrorist violence,
just don't wanna be the bad
conspiracy
guy
theories, the
anymore.
widespread
That's what it
rejection
is.
of science and authority, anti-government mobilization,
Who
and
wants to be the
horrific
bad guy
inequality
now?
in place across the West. To take my own country as an example, a country that likes to refer to itself as the longest continuous democracy and the so-called leader of the free world, we landed on a list of backsliding democracies 3 years ago because of declining civil liberties, challenges to free speech and right of association, challenges to election integrity and trust in elections, and runaway polarization. But it's not just democracy that's failing in the West, and this is really what I want to talk about today, because communities and families are struggling too in a backsliding on social well-being. Social connection to and trust in others has been declining for decades. 50 years ago, nearly half of Americans reported feeling that they could trust fellow citizens. That's less than a third today. Polarization is
I don't
at near
trust any
historic highs.
motherfuckers.
We have rising numbers of people diagnosed with depression and a rising use of antidepressants, with particularly striking data coming from the UK, but also across other Western countries, along with spikes in suicide rates,
this didn't
deaths of
do shit.
despair, which are overdoses, alcohol-fueled
Alright, I'm gonna put
deaths.
this away so I can actually run
Reports of
around.
isolation and depression and
Maybe I can come
anxiety,
back.
especially for men and boys. And perhaps ironically, on that point, the West's insistence on a rigid gender binary and strict rules for masculine and feminine behavior exacerbates those trends. So out of Switzerland, we have new data showing that men
It's
who
okay to be
strongly
gay,
adhere
guys.
to traditional masculine ideals around suppressing their emotions and refusing to be vulnerable are twice as likely to
It's
attempt
okay to be
suicide
feminine.
as other men. It doesn't
Be-
help that people spend less and less time in the company of other human beings. And that's worse
Be happy
for
in
15
your
to
manhood,
24-year-olds
however
who spend
manly it is.
70% less
You'll never
time
be
in
the
person
manliest.
today with friends than they did 2 decades ago.
And you'll never be the gayest.
That's particularly meaningful, given that the strength of
okay to be
adolescent
who you are.
friendships predicts a whole host of well-being measures into adulthood, from healthy romantic relationships to lower anxiety, aggression, and improved adult mental health overall.
Yeah, now I can actually run.
It's that last point where I want to spend the rest of my time today on how our unrelentingly online lives are undermining not only our social well-being, but our democracies themselves. If the West is headed for collapse, I will argue it will be in no small part at the hands of the crisis of information that online ecosystems have introduced, including widespread and unrelenting exposure to, and increasing beliefs in conspiracy theories, propaganda, mis, and malinformation, and the
Propaganda.
rejection of science, academic expertise, and traditional sources of knowledge and information, including
Traditional
media.
sources of knowledge, except for other
So
ways of
disinformation
knowing.
and conspiracy theories are powerful
Did you know there's other ways
mobilizers
of
mass
knowing?
violence, including some of the worst examples
Don't be
of
white.
anti-democratic violence we've seen in recent history. The U.S. Capitol attackers were so far down disinformation rabbit holes that they fervently believed they were the courageous revolutionary actors who were saving democracy. Similar momentum mobilized the storming of the German parliament just a few months earlier, and an attack on the Canadian Prime Minister's residence by an armed conspiracy theorist just weeks before that. Conspiracy theories about a great replacement or Eurabia have mobilized terrorist actors right here in Norway, Germany, New Zealand, across the US, and elsewhere. It's hard to overstate the ease with which ordinary people have embraced harmful online content in a wide variety of range.
What would you say harmful online
categories,
content
conspiracy
is?
theories, propaganda, disinformation, just to name 3. So there's several ways this has evolved, I would argue,
Misinformation
into a
generally?
crisis from which we might not return, and I just want to touch on 3 here.
Oh, that's cute. Look
First,
at that.
we're on the heels of a successful, decades-long
That's very
campaign
cute.
by the conservative and far right across the West to attack mainstream expertise in general and higher educational institutions in particular
take a screenshot.
as bastions of leftist brainwashing that seek to undermine and dismantle Western societies from within. Let's be clear, professors do skew
Let us be
left.
clear.
But there's plentiful evidence
Screenshot.
showing that liberal professors do not produce more liberal students. There's no mass brainwashing effort on campus. There's no global project to use universities as a tool of thought control in the so-called cultural Marxist revolution, which is a conspiracy theory that puts universities at the helm of an orchestrated effort by global communists to overthrow capitalist and Western societies from the inside.
I mean,
Once a fringe conspiracy theory, the phrase cultural
We all kinda
Marxism
believe
edged
that.
its way into the mainstream as part of a set of arguments that warn the left is trying to destroy Western society through things like feminism, a disrupted gender binary, multiculturalism, Muslim immigration, and gay rights, which will
Yeah.
supposedly undermine the West,
I don't
the
know.
nation, capitalism, and
they don't
traditional
seem to like the West
Judeo-Christian
or
values
capitalism
all
or
at
anything
once.
like that. Some do.
Putting universities at the center of this plot made higher education the predominant site of the culture wars that the conservative and far right have
Got some
claimed
enemies.
are undermining Western civilization. In and of itself, I wouldn't see that as particularly problematic. We can debate those issues all you want, and I'm sure we will today. But years of attacks on higher education
Yeah, good.
that now increasingly take place within an online ecosystem that offers plenty of alternative facts as sources of information
Alternative
have done
facts.
real damage. The far right's attacks on higher education ultimately anchored a broad assault on specialized knowledge and expertise more generally in ways that have undermined the credibility of expert scholars, facts, and arguments.
I'm gonna get shot
Public
here.
health experts, the free press, scientists, and others have increasingly become suspect, accused of partisan bias or disregarded entirely.
Yep, there it
The
comes.
overall effect has been a weakening of the
There it
legitimacy
comes.
of sources of knowledge and trust in the kinds of expertise
This is a place
that have
where people like to
historically
hang out and
helped
kill
build
each other.
shared ways of
Had a
explaining
lot of
and
fights here.
understanding our worlds. The consequences of this, from anti-vax movements that have broad public health
anomalies.
consequences, to lost trust in the courts, vulnerability to disinformation about stolen elections, are clear. By undermining the public's sources of factual information, attacks on higher
There's gonna
education
be a
and
guy up
expertise
here.
have created broader receptivity to propaganda and conspiracy
He wants
theories.
me to help him get his dead brother out.
Second, this is all made worse by the fact that we spend most of our time now, or much of our days, in an online ecosystem that's vast and ever expanding and full of harmful content, including massive amounts of fake and false and disinformation content that are sometimes hard to distinguish from reality, including because of AI-generated images and videos that are realistic enough to fool expert analysts, let alone ordinary citizens. Added to that is the problem that most people now get their news not from traditional media, but from social media, which has created immense risks as disinformation, propaganda, and conspiracy theories spread quickly online. Not least because even in the best of circumstances, tech companies' trust and safety policies are necessarily reactive. They're a Band-Aid solution focused on content moderation and removal of harmful information
I need, like, a
that's often been
heavier
viewed
bag
and
or
downloaded
something, whatever.
millions and millions of times before removal, and then is easily uploaded and shared again on mainstream and dark web platforms alike. And we've seen that with terrorist live stream videos over the past several years. Perhaps even worse, algorithmic recommendations actually feed harmful content directly to users even when they're not searching for it. An Australian study recently replicated in Ireland found that teenage boys' accounts encounter toxic male supremacist content within minutes on YouTube Shorts
Toxic
and TikTok,
white supremacist?
even when they're not looking
Okay.
for it. And that if an account shows any interest by watching that content, within 2 to 3 hours, the vast majority of content that is recommended to them is anti-feminist, misogynistic, and male supremacist. That content comes to boys
True.
and men no matter what they do. In particular, wherever they are online,
I don't know what I'm supposed to find
subtly
here.
and not so subtly shaping their views of gender, hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, and ideas about power, control, and the acceptability of violence. Third and finally, and I won't have time to get into this, but
These
maybe
are
we will
ideas that will
in
never,
discussion.
probably never go away.
Our time in
but
those
will need
online
to be
ecosystems is even
consistently
riskier,
debated.
it's worth saying, because of
Over and
fake
over and
news
over and
and
over and over
disinformation
again.
that's propagated by hostile
The best way to
foreign
deal with
actors
it is to learn the
intending
talking
disrupt
points,
the West,
learn the
further
defense
polarize us, and explicitly weaken kind of social cohesion and trust across identities. And so a new EU report on foreign interference, for example, that I just read, has documented systematic meddling in elections and interference in democratic elections across the EU, and points to the need for more proactive measures to address it, but it's really just sort of scratching the surface. So what can we do about this? I promise I'm not going to leave you with just the bad news, but I'm not going to come back to the good news until the very end. So we have 3 minutes at the end to wrap up, and I'm going to tell you about what works to prevent people from going down these rabbit holes. And that is the good news. We do have really good evidence that it can be prevented. The question is do we have time to prevent it further? But for now, I'll just wrap up to say,
is this a good
my
weapon?
answer
I don't
to
think
the
it
framing
is.
question is yes. The West is in decline, and my argument to justify that answer is that this decline is rooted in large part in a crisis in how we encounter, receive, and evaluate information in an increasingly online world. Attacks on higher education and specialized expertise, including in the media, combined with relentless exposure to bad, false, harmful, and fake content online, has weakened the legitimacy of what are supposed to be our most trusted sources of knowledge and expertise. And this means we now lack shared ways of explaining, interpreting, and understanding our worlds in ways that have led far too many people to readily accept conspiracy theories, scapegoating, fear-mongering, and other authoritarian tactics.
You know, this is a proper debate has a stage
democracies across the West and around
and
the world.
a microphone.
So I will return at the end to the good news about
Not a Zoom call.
ways to prevent people from being persuaded by harmful and manipulative content, including at scale, from recent evidence. But for now, I really want to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Oh, there's 2 of them. Great.
There's going to be so much to dive into here.
Bring up.
Let's get our next speaker up, Yanis Varoufakis.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the Hollywood Prize for giving me an opportunity to engage with the question. So, is the West in decline? Most definitely not. But don't get your hopes high. This is no reason to rejoice, especially if you treasure, as I do, the values that have come to be espoused by the West over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Now, who is it that is truly worried and has surrendered to the thought that the West is declining? Starting from this continent, mostly of European conservatives, centrists, leftists, beyond Europe, intellectuals from the global south, and more recently, after their recent trouncing in the hands of a
It's not
resurgent
fun
Donald
getting
Trump,
fucked up, I
US
guess.
Democrats.
Full pack.
I think they're all wrong. Never before has so much power been concentrated in the hands of so few persons and postcodes in the West. So why all this navel gazing in the West? Why have so many good people in the West and beyond the West, around the world, surrender themselves to this conviction or feeling that the West is fading, it is declining? In Europe, there is good cause. Just as the Roman Empire shifted its capital from Rome to Constantinople in order to gain another 1,000 years of hegemony, so too the center of the West's gravity shifted from Britain and Europe to the United States of America in exactly the same way that Emperor Constantine effectively surrendered or abandoned Rome to the barbarians. Europe, too, has been abandoned to the forces of stagnation, which are rendering, as we speak, the European Union inert, backward, and increasingly irrelevant. But there is a second reason. One is Eurocentrism. It is the reason, I just mentioned it, why the European bourgeoisie is in such a state of moral panic, so eager to confuse its own decline for the decline of the West. But the second reason is far more delicious. It is a paradox. Like a snake sheds old skin. The West has shed its own value system over the last few decades. A value system which was utterly necessary to the West to maintain its ascendancy during the 20th century, which, however, during the 21st century is surplus to requirements. It is holding the West's triumphant march back. If you think about this from the perspective of...
what is the value system that you're critiquing?
The manner in which the West rose up. How did the West rise up? In precisely the same way that capitalism did not need democracy in order to rise. It is a mistake to think that democracy is a prerequisite for capitalism.
Democracy is the way you regulate capitalism.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, in Europe, there's no democracy.
I think you're missing
in
this
China,
point.
and you have a capitalist explosion in China. Similarly, the Western value system was not functional to the rise of the West. Indeed, precisely the opposite. It was brutal exploitation at home, along with the opium trade, the slave trade, and a number of genocides in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa, which
is that what it was? It wasn't the Industrial Revolution?
Of the West. We had that already from Cynthia.
Our economy was not the strongest.
That was the foundation for the great
during
trading empires.
The point of the slavery,
the Dutch
and
Empire,
if that was
the
case, then the
French,
South would
be
in better situation than
that was
the
the
North.
foundation.
The North wouldn't have won.
Come to think of it, the great mansions, the estates, the magnificent opera houses and museums, like this one, were initially founded not on wishy-washy principles like, the rule of law, or equality before the law, or democracy, or human solidarity. They were founded on sheer, brutal, naked exploitation and extraction. So, what is the origin of the Western value system?
That's your axiom.
That I personally treasure, and which, in the end, was espoused and embraced by most of us in the West. What is the origin of that? Well, for a long, long while, the power of the West, outside the strict borders and confines of the West, was unassailable. Europe sent millions of usually armed colonists to the four corners of the world. As I said, they extracted and they subjugated. They took one look at natives and chose not to see them as human beings.
You guys are gonna kill me?
Deciding that, or declaring that their land was terra nullius, a land without a people, for settlers craving
Don't
that
talk to me.
particular land. The first move in every genocide, whether it happened in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa, or in today's Palestine.
Sorry, I didn't realize that we
However
were
unassailable
broadcasting you
the
on
power
this.
of the West was outside the West. At home, Western power met very significant resistance. Substantial challenges, primarily from its own wretched working classes, but also from the petty bourgeoisie. Western power was shaken by economic crises at the home front, which were primarily due
this
to
is
the
where
fact
those assholes
that
were.
the many
Damn it.
were too impecunious to be able to afford the products that they were producing in the factories of the few. These tensions spilled over into massive industrial
I'm gonna get
strength
fucked up by those
wars
things
between
again.
Western powers. Western powers competing for market share, some call it vital space, culminating into two lethal world wars. These, let's call them setbacks, forced the powers that be in the West to make concessions. Domestically, we know what form the concessions took.
Have an energy
They took
drink.
the form
Yeah.
of more democratization of health systems, public health systems, of social security, of pension. But internationally, the outrage at the lethality of the Western wars, the Western civil wars within the West, as well as the genocides especially after the Second World War, led to the scripting
This is
of
where those guys are.
universal declarations of human rights, of the UN Charter, of even the foundation of international courts of justice and international criminal courts.
The bastards hang out near
For
anomalies.
2 decades after the Second World War, at least 2 decades, maybe a little bit more, the West basked in the warm glow of the Western value system that we had created after World War II.
So why
It
did
was
we
what
ever
we
have
used to do.
democracy, Giannis?
And it
Just a
coincided
question.
with the shift of the Western center of gravity from Europe to the United States. And it was a period, the 1950s and 1960s, during which we created, well, the West created, to be more precise, the United States created, an audacious, magnificent, globally planned, centrally planned, international monetary system known as the Bretton Woods system, which allowed the United States to recycle its own surpluses in Europe and in Japan, effectively guaranteeing its own net exports to Europe and to Japan by dollarizing America's allies. But then 1971 comes, the 15th of August.
Is your face that
The
cold?
Nixon shock. And all bets are off. What had happened, of course, was the United States had become a deficit country. But instead of tightening its belt, Washington, D.C., powers that be in Washington, instead of doing that which Germany would do, or impose on everybody else to do, which is austerity, tightening belts, eliminate deficit, they did exactly the opposite. They said, okay, now we are a deficit country. Now we have a 2-3% trade deficit of GDP. So what are we going to do? We're going to step on the accelerator and max out the trade deficit. This is precisely what has been happening since 1971. And it was not an accident. It was a wild beauty to behold, because this expanding trade deficit of the United States started functioning like a gigantic vacuum cleaner that was sucking out of Germany, Japan, later China, the net exports of those factories, of their factories, into the United States.
Is
And
that
what
what
did
happened?
the German, the Japanese, the Indonesian, the Vietnamese, and of course ultimately the Chinese capitalists do with all the dollars that they were receiving for all the stuff that they were exporting to the United States? What can you do with these torrents of dollars? But take them back to New York City and to Wall Street. To do what? To buy US treasuries. In other words, think about this. This is remarkable. This is the first time in human history that the hegemon getting stronger the more into the red its trade and government budgets balance goes. It has never
Look at these
happened.
soldiers.
Every other hegemon who went into the
I'm
red
missing the show. Sorry.
collapsed. The United States became stronger as a result of expanding, of the burgeoning trade deficit. Because the trade deficit, through
You
this
need cover
recycling
for it.
system, through the capitalist profits outside the United States,
Dude, you guys are getting rocked.
and they use this money to fund the American government, which can then afford not to tax the rich or the middle class to the level that we tax the rich and the middle class in Europe. They could afford to have an army that has bases in 170 countries. And what else did the foreign capitalists do with the money that they brought?
Unkillable beasts.
Well, they bought real estate. To
While
the
they're
great
doing that,
joy
I'm gonna
of
go
the Donald
this
Trump types. And they bought a few shares, whatever shares the American authorities allowed foreigners to purchase, usually in second-rate companies, because of protectionism. Yeah. Now, at some point, the ruling class in the United States had an epiphany.
What's that?
Since we're trusting the foreign capitalists to send their dollars back to us, why don't we trust them to send the manufacturers back to us? So why don't we export whole production lines to Vietnam, to China, to Indonesia, to India, to all sorts of places? That is the cause of the deindustrialization. Now, for this recycling mechanism to work, remember, Wall Street is at the heart of it. This is why you had deregulation of Wall Street under the Clinton administration. Larry Summers, Jim Geithner, the usual, handmaidens of Wall Street. And of course, to deregulate, to bin all the great regulations, the Glass-Steagall Act, all the remnants of the magnificence of what was the New Deal once and the Bretton Woods system, you need an ideology. You need a cloak of respectability. You need a theory, an economic, a political economy. Thus, the rise of what is called neoliberalism, which, by the way, is neither new nor liberal.
Peter.
With this cloak of respectability and the political philosophy and political economy and helpful handmaidens in government, I mentioned, Larry Summers and the rest, Wall Street was allowed to go gangbusters. They minted mounted ranges of derivatives on the back of the tsunami of capital that was coming from Europe, from Japan, later from China, into the books of the Wall Street bankers. Do you remember the Brothers Grimm story featuring a pot which apparently incessantly produces whatever its owner commanded it to? And do you remember how the moral of the story, how it ends? The village is flooded with porridge. Well, this is exactly what Wall Street did. It flooded the West's financial circuits with these Amazons of what Warren Buffett so aptly described as weapons of mass financial destruction, which at some point self-ignited in 2007 and exploded in 2008. And then, immediately, in a state of utter panic, the great and good leaders of the West gathered in London in April 2009, under the auspices and the chairmanship of a certain Mr. Gordon Brown.
I'm probably going to die here.
And what they decided to do was to save the financiers by printing, and then printing some more. Between then and today, they printed $35,000 billion on behalf of the financiers. That's 35 trillion. While at the same time practicing rather harsh austerity on their own populations. So you have socialism for the financiers and austerity, harsh austerity for the demos. The result? Grand celebrations in the leafy suburbs and, of course, the gated communities where the haves hide from the have-nots. This is the process by which the West jettisoned its values.
All right, I'm going to wait here for a minute.
The only ones who invested a small part, or a large part, but in proportional terms, a small part of the minted trillions was big tech. And that gave them the cloud capital with which they can now pollute our minds, control our minds, and control and poison the conversation. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to finish by saying that
shit, I died for some reason.
The West is not declining. It is going, as I said, along with Wall Street, gangbusters. But it is shedding the value system. As we are moving towards the natural, mathematical, logical conclusion of this process, I'm very much afraid that the West is not going to end with a whimper, but it will most probably end with a bang, given the escalating new Cold War with China, a bang after which I don't think China or anyone else or any other bloc is going to dominate, but rather we're going to be in a kind of post-apocalyptic aftermath where the Mad Max movies will be a sort of a documentary. Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm looking forward to this debate. Trust Yanis to throw another sort of bomb in. Goodness, what a coherent path we're going to try to challenge to weave after we've heard from our final speaker, Konstantin Kisin.
I'm going to stand behind the podium, otherwise I feel I'll blend into the chairs with my suit. It's great to be here, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure it is to have been invited. And of course, it's wonderful to be in the beautiful city of Bergen, one of the very few places in the world where the weather is even worse than London. It's great to be here. I'm afraid, being British, I will begin with an apology. Unlike our distinguished speakers, I'm not a professor of anything, and unlike Yanis, I've never been charged with saving the Greek economy from collapse, a task whose achievability I regard with some skepticism. But the one thing I can offer, perhaps, is that I have a very different perspective on things to most Westerners, despite being one. I am both an insider and an outsider. I was born in the Soviet Union and grew up there, and then early 1990s Russia, before moving to England as a teenager. And being Russian, I must also begin with a warning, I'm afraid. Many of you will be familiar with the story of the boiling frog, a frog that sits in water that gets increasingly warmer without noticing the frog is cooked. Well, those of us who come from Eastern Europe have been cooked before. And my warning is that it's getting really hot in here, I'm afraid. So, by the way, I love that Yanis is present, and Cynthia's too, of course, but Yanis is present. I mean, if he's arguing that the West is not in decline, I'm really terrified of what decline is going to look like by comparison. Now, the subject of tonight's debate is whether the West is in decline, but to answer it, I must address an obvious question, at least to me, that sits underneath this entire discussion, which is the fact that many people in our societies, including many intellectuals, journalists, and academics, would like our society to be in decline, because it validates the worldview that they have of the rich imperial white colonialists who must be finally stripped of their ill-gotten gains of the kind that we've just heard described on stage. And I say that this sits underneath our discussion because once a society has sufficiently imbibed this mind virus, it is inevitably going to question its own survival. If enough people believe that their society is bad, how could they not bring about its decline? Now, let me be clear. I don't think decline is inevitable. On the contrary, I think it's extremely avoidable. We just have to choose to avoid it. And my warning is not intended to provoke paralysis. It's intended to provoke action. Incidentally, before we go on, the question about whether the West is good and worth preserving has an easy, obvious, and uncontestable answer. That answer is Australia. Australia is a Western country in a non-Western part of the world, surrounded by non-Western countries. I was there earlier this year. And in Australia, there are precisely 0 people who get onto rickety boats every year to brave shark-infested waters in search of a better life elsewhere. 0 people. The traffic is all one way, in the opposite direction. The same is true on the southern border of the United States. The same is true in the Mediterranean. The same is true in the English Channel, where tens of thousands of people cross over from Calais into Britain illegally every year. And I'm not blaming the people. I wouldn't want to stay in France either.
Ooh.
My point is, if you look at how people vote with their feet, Western civilization blows the competition out of the water. I know this is politically incorrect to say nowadays, but our civilization is better. I know you don't like to hear it, but it is. That's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of millions of people who come every year, and the hundreds of millions who would if they could. And that is despite the fact that we are undoubtedly going through a period of decline. Now, what do I mean by decline? I think we do owe an explanation and a definition, and each of us probably has our own. In 1978, my countryman Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had just left the Soviet Union after many years in the gulags, came to the United States and gave an address to the Harvard students on their commencement address. And here's what he said. Let me quote him briefly. "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, in each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society. Of course, there are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life. Political and
Looking for
intellectual
solar array
bureaucrats
parts.
showed depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in theoretical reflections to explain how realistic, reasonable, and intellectually, and even morally warranted it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. And decline in courage is ironically emphasized by occasional explosions of anger and inflexibility on the part of those same bureaucrats when dealing with weak governments and weak countries not supported by anyone, or with currents which cannot offer any resistance. But they get tongue-tied and paralyzed when they deal with powerful governments and threatening forces, with aggressors and international terrorists. Should one point out that from ancient times, decline in courage has been considered the beginning of the end. I'm sad to say that his message has aged excruciatingly well. Not only is it still true, it's more true today than it was 50 years ago. But forget Solzhenitsyn. How about we listen to our fellow citizens? In Britain, 68% of people, when polled in a recent Ipsos poll, said that Britain is in decline. Why do British people feel this way? Well, we're inherently miserable. That's part of it, but in case it's just not the only explanation, let's look at the facts. In Britain, GDP per capita fell very sharply in 2007 during the financial crisis, and has still not recovered. Put simply, on average, British people are poorer today than they were in 2007. And I'm afraid to say, this is true here in Norway, too. It's true in Sweden, in Iceland, in Finland, in France, in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and in Ireland. I'm afraid it's true in Greece, where the GDP fell from $32,000 in 2008 to just $23,000 today. And this is not an accident. Because politicians are judged on whether they grow GDP, not GDP per capita, they don't actually care about whether we are getting richer or poorer. The easiest way to deliver GDP growth is to increase the number of bodies in the country, the number of people. That's the way you do it. And the way they've done it, by importing low-skill, low-wage people from other parts of the world, has made us poorer in a way that we can't blame them for it. Economic growth in Britain is not just anemic, it's fake.
I don't know
it's an
where
accounting
these parts
trick.
are.
As for Europe, it's been an economic decline for at least a decade. That's not me telling you that or Yanis telling you that. Those are the words of José Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission, writing earlier this week. Now look, money isn't everything. It can't buy you happiness. Although it can buy you cars with heated seats, which is the closest thing to happiness that I've discovered in Norway.
I love heated seats. That changed my life.
But the absence of money does make misery a lot more probable. I'm going to talk about Britain for a moment, but wherever you've come from or wherever you're watching this on the internet, see if this rings a bell. We release dangerous criminals from prison because of overcrowding. The police do not investigate crimes like burglaries and car breaks. We have growing NHS waiting lists, and even the anger we saw spill out on the streets of Britain during the summer is in large part a product of a stagnating economy. The average age for somebody buying their first apartment or house in Britain is 34. In London, where all the good jobs are, it's 37. Which means that even the small fraction of our young people who can afford to buy their own house will probably do it when it's too late for them to have children for purely biological reasons. And while expensive housing and the stagnating economy are not the only explanation for this, they are a significant contributor to the fact that Britain's total fertility rate has fallen massively in the last 60 years. In 1964, the average British woman had 3 children. Today, we are way below replacement. As with other troubles of this kind, Britain is not alone. From the US to the entire European Union to Canada, New Zealand, and
what
Australia,
about these third world countries?
we are not even close to having enough children. This is not a uniquely Western phenomenon, but it is particularly bad in the West. Now look, I don't claim to know what the right number of human beings on planet Earth is.
We reached the level of comfort
and when I spend an hour on doom scrolling on social media, I increasingly think that number is 0.
That's all it is.
But what I do know is that if you were a zoologist studying an animal species which was failing to reproduce, you would hardly conclude that everything is going swimmingly. Have you ever heard the expression, it's like getting pandas to mate? It's used to say that something is very difficult because zoos and conservationists are struggling to maintain the panda population. Well, the average female panda will have 5 to 6 children over the course of her lifetime. The average Western female human will have 1.5. This phenomenon has cultural, economic, and even spiritual dimensions. But the fact is that a society which is not having enough children to replace its population is not only doomed to decline, it's also doomed to the mass, uncontrolled immigration of the kind that the entire Western world has seen in recent years. And the reason I bring up mass immigration is that a nation can endure and bounce back from periods of stagnation and even decline, provided there's a sense of common purpose and a willingness to be honest about the problems that society faces. In Britain, we have neither. The nation and the common purpose that came with it is rapidly becoming a thing of the past, to be replaced by the much celebrated communities we hear so much about. Instead of seeing ourselves as British first and everything else second, we increasingly see ourselves as Asian, black, white, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, LGBTQI+ first, and little else second. As for honesty,
that's called freedom,
we shun,
everybody.
ostracize, and in Britain increasingly set the police on people who express
Imagine if you're like forced to be like, I'm an American,
about illegal
if you're like
immigration,
not
Islamist terrorism, and the failure of multiculturalism.
so excited they might throw you
Especially
in a re-education
if they come
camp.
from the
Is that
working
what you want?
class, whose
Kiss 'em?
crass ways and ugly sentiments offend the chattering classes. And yet, despite all of this, I see no urgency. When I listen to the people who run my country, of all political persuasions, they all think that this is normal, a problem to be managed. I assumed this was the case, that they were putting this face on for public consumption, but I'm afraid behind closed doors, they're all exactly the same. And people say that if we were attacked, we'd struggle to get people to enlist. I think that's complete nonsense. I think if we suffered what the people of Ukraine have suffered, or what the people of Israel suffered on October 7, there would be millions of people in our countries that would rise to defend it, and millions of others to support the war effort.
I'm evil.
But the problem is, we're not in a war. There is no enemy to fight. And so nobody knows what to do, which is why what we have is just a creeping, unstoppable malaise.
A malaise,
Even now,
he says.
with the wave of enthusiasm that has swept Argentina and the United States. Because the problem is not our politicians, it's us. Milei won in Argentina because he promised to cut red tape, taxes, and bureaucrats with his chainsaw of freedom.
Yeah.
Trump won in America because he promised to cut regulation, taxes, and waste. Europeans, on the other hand, are very clear. We want higher taxes and more government. This is why no politician in Britain or in Europe talks about unleashing the talents
he wants
of our people.
capitalist
We don't want to be
top-down,
unleashed. We want to be looked
no
after.
democratic. I mean,
We
where
need
does
to recognize that the answer
democracy
to our
fit into
problems
this?
is to create a vibrant and growing economy,
Democracy is
not to
voting
hike up
to
tax rates and
eliminate
energy
regulation.
prices to chase industrial, creative, and
How
wealthy
does that
people
benefit anybody,
out of our country.
except for-
Britain, if you don't know, has lost more millionaires in recent years than any country in the world except China.
Except for the bourgeois.
We need to spend more time focusing on building wealth instead of arguing about how to divide it.
I agree.
We need to aspire to do things, to make things, to create things.
I absolutely 100% agree.
I know that many of you don't like him, but if you're even remotely curious or intellectually honest, you have to ask yourself, why has Elon Musk become an icon to hundreds of millions of people around the world?
Because he's techie.
It's not his charismatic speeches and stunning good looks.
No.
It's the fact that he builds big things.
Yeah.
And in doing so, reminds us who we're supposed to be. We're supposed
He's
to
kind
reach
of an
for the
asshole,
stars, not into our neighbors'
Build
pockets.
things without being an asshole. How about that?
I know that to the British ear, and by the judging by your faces, also to the Norwegian ear, this sounds like immense cringe. I understand. I do. This mindset shift we need is going to be very difficult. It's like getting Westerners to mate.
Nice.
But I'm here to tell you something that you already know. Until we decide to become a civilization that wants to succeed, we will not. Thank you very much.
Okay, I mean, his points weren't so terrible except for when he brought up maybe he
where to start
sucks
with this?
off Malay and
Yanis
Elon
and
a
Cynthia,
bit so
come on,
much.
Konstantin, do sit down.
I'm excited to
I
hear
think I should start
the response.
with what the ideal
The only
is.
thing we're missing is Dugan
What
with
is
his fourth
the
political
dream?
theory in here. We have the
Because
libertarian fascist, we have the
in a way, the question is the Western decline.
communist, and we have this
and it
Democrat
will come on to
lady.
whether, I mean, the very fact that we're asking this question when you think everyone wants the world to be in decline would suggest...
Not everyone.
Okay, well, come on to that. What I want to know, though, in a way, from the starting point, is what's the dream? Presumably, first of all, the dream is that other nations become wealthier.
Whose dream?
Sorry?
Whose dream are you asking us?
I'm asking each of your
Each
dreams.
of us.
I'm asking for you to paint, and it's a kind of naive idea
Whose
because, of course,
dream?
you know, it'll never happen. But let's just, if
His dream is
if you
communism,
could control things,
which is cute.
would you want every other nation to become as wealthy as the West? Would you want them to become as democratic as the West? Yanis,
Oh, me.
why not?
Well, allow me to answer by means of an example, which touches upon something Konstantin said. That, you know, the riffraff out there, outside the West, are dying to come to our shores, and therefore it means that we're civilized and we're better. Well, take the Democratic Republic of Congo. The King of Belgium created a slave colony there for 30 years, then it was taken over by the state of Belgium for 40 years. Then, as they were gaining independence, the CIA murdered their first president. And now today, Glencore, one of our great corporations, is mining all sorts of cobalt derivatives and so on, giving zero to the people of the Republic of Congo. I'd like to live in a West which is not a parasite on people that it then denigrates by saying that you're
Yeah, the
the
cobalt
riffraff and
problem
you want
is
to
a
come to a
problem.
beautiful garden.
It's a good problem.
And this is why, you know, and therefore our dream is to stop you from coming, which is your dream.
Okay, no, but in a way...
There we go. Look at that long.
But is the ultimate aim, I mean, if you could do it, that yes, you don't have whatever the mining companies doing whatever they do in other nations, but those nations build up. I'm just wondering if the dream is a multipolar world.
Well, very
Yes.
briefly, the dream is to have cooperation, solidarity, and genuine development of everyone that lives on this planet.
And the land of milk and honey, too. We must
Okay.
have that.
So, Konstantin, is that what you would also say?
Well, we only have an
I
hour
mean,
and
a
40
multi-
minutes, so let me be brief.
The multipolar world, is that something that you should
No,
say?
the multipolar world is an atrocious idea whose consequences will be exactly the consequences we have when you see a multipolar world within one country. That country is Mexico. Mexico is controlled by a large number of cartels.
Yeah.
And when one of them is taken out, what ensues is a chaotic fight for dominance again. And the multipolar world will lead to conflagration, inevitably, because somebody has to be on top. It's unavoidable. And
Somebody has to be on
Of course.
top.
You know, Yanis's point about cooperation is entirely wonderful, but the best way to predict human behavior is to look at human behavior in the past. When is this great age in which everyone just sat
So that's a good
together?
argument to bring back slavery, because almost
Well,
every
since we're
society
on the
until
subject of
200 years
slavery,
ago
let me just
had slavery.
May I address what Yanis has said repeatedly? Actually, I think it's important to do so. What he said on stage during his presentation is entirely true, which is that many of the riches of Western societies are the product of the resources that were taken from other parts of the world. What I'm afraid this analysis is missing is the fact that during that time, as during the present time, the entire world was competing on that very same model. The only reason that the European powers were able to be as effective as they were is that they had superior technology. And superior
China
superior
had far
technology.
more superior technology, and they were not imperial.
May I
Yanis,
finish?
1 second.
Okay.
I will come to
Okay.
you to respond, but
But
let's
let's
let
be-
Konstantin make
let's
his
be
point.
factually correct.
We've got an hour and 40. We're good.
I think
It was
I'd
only
like-
Europe that set out to
Yanis.
destroy,
Yeah,
to
Yanis.
extract.
I
Right,
let
we've
you
only
finish.
just started. Konstantin.
It's too. I'm also slightly Greek, so this is Greek on Greek violence here.
Don't Greek
Get to the
me,
point, because
buddy.
otherwise...
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to need a little time to get to the point, especially if I'm interrupted. So, Every other civilization in human history has practiced slavery in one form or another. Every other civilization, including the Native Americans, who were enslaving each other and anyone they could find, the Middle Eastern Arab slave trade across the Saharan desert was worse and lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade. And every other great empire in history attempted to practice slavery to the very best of its ability, to do the very thing that Yanis rightly accuses Western powers of doing. Now, the reason the West was more successful at this is it was more technologically advanced and was able to transport people across oceans in a way that at that time no other civilization could. So yes, it is true that the Western history is one of colonialism and enslavement, but that is only because we were better at it than other people. That's the only reason that we are where we are.
So just to go, I will come to you in a minute,
So
but just to go back to the
34.
specific question.
Yes.
Yeah, what is going
Should
on
we
here?
be aiming
Do I have to
towards
get
a
all this stuff?
multipolar world? You would say, look, we're a competitive world. Let's just compete against everyone else.
I would say that the best world is a stable one, and the construction we have had for some time now has been one of the best periods in human history since the end of World War II. Now, why has that been?
For the West?
Well, I would argue for the billions of people around the world who've been lifted out of poverty during the same time, in addition to for the West. Now, is that maintainable? Well, that's, I think, the issue that we're in discussions about. I don't know if that's maintainable, but my argument, the argument I made, and the reason that we're having this debate about slavery, is that I consider Western values, I don't think we should bomb them into the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, as some of our leaders have been attempting to do. But they are the best values, at least for those of us who want to live in the West, and we should maintain them as much as we possibly can, and then other people may wish to buy into that worldview as well.
Okay, Cynthia, where are you on this?
Well, I think it's really important to point out that when you're talking about refugees at least, most refugees are not running towards something, they're running from something. I mean, we've sort of skipping the safety bit. And people want to be at home, right? People want to be home in their culture, in their language, with their family. We know that, and I think nobody wants to get into a rickety boat with their infant and cross and make a risky crossing. They're doing that because they have no choice but to do that. And I think if we want to change that pattern, you have to invest in regions of the world, safety, reduction of violence, reduction of gang. I mean, you look at what people are fleeing from, the kidnappings, the executions, the assaults, rapes in Central and South America, what people flee to the southern border, why they're doing that, I think, is also on us, to not pay attention to kind of investing in those regions.
Okay, so with an ultimate aim of a multipolar world.
I mean, I don't see any other alternative than a multipolar world, but I also think that it's important to remember that nations have never been only one thing. They're constantly reimagined. They've always been reimagined, and perhaps they should be. So, in Germany, where I spent many years doing research, you look at the history books, the Huguenots showed up, and everybody, is having a freak out about French, right? Like, there's always been immigration, migration, patterns of change, you just look at the Germanic tribes, the Romans, right? I mean, these things, there've always been flows. So maybe we have to reimagine what it is to be a nation as well.
Okay, now, Yanis, I know I stopped you and it wasn't always
that's okay,
clear
you did
to
well.
But was there something...
There is too much testosterone on the stage between the two of us.
I don't know, the estrogen is trying to match it
It's a good thing you put me in the middle.
But was there something that you specifically objected to? I just wanted to give you a chance.
I don't know, Yanis. You're folding your legs very estrogenic.
Factually, it's completely wrong. It's only the West that has created industrial-scale imperialism. If you look at the Arab lands, if you look at the Chinese had the technology, the Indians had the technology, the Indians had an industrial revolution before Britain, and they did not conquer the rest of the world. They did not do what the British and the Dutch and the French did. So it is, for me, just completely factually wrong, and therefore the conversation is not particularly interesting to say, oh, look, somebody would have transported, once they got the technology, hundreds of millions of Africans to their place in order to create sugar plantations or, cotton plantations. It's not true.
But that's exactly what the Islamic world did. The Islamic world expanded from a tiny part of land to conquer all of southern Europe and all of North Africa.
But this is a fake history of the Islamic world.
Hold on a second. And not only that, to transport more Africans from sub-Saharan Africa into the Arab world than the Western powers collectively
did. Look, we can't settle this now, but allow me just make one point if I can.
That's a good point.
Something else Konstantin said.
Worth investigating.
The crisis of 2008 did deplete per capita incomes across the West, but for the reasons that
Did I get them all?
I put forward. Austerity for everyone, except for the financiers. It had nothing to do with migration. In your talk, you made it sound as if it was immigration that created the problems. No, immigration was utterly irrelevant to the crisis of 2008. It was the bankers that created that, and it was the combination of quantitative easing and austerity, which created some room for people to come in and fill the gaps.
Okay, pause. May I just very briefly to say, I actually agree with Yanis about, I was not suggesting remotely that the immigration had caused the 2007 financial crash. What I was suggesting is our failure to recover is a product of the fact that our politicians bring in people who work for low wages to pretend GDP is growing when it's not. However, may I just address this point about refugees? First of all, most of the people who are coming on small boats are not coming with the infants. They're mostly young men. Number one. Number two, this idea that most of this immigration is based on the fleeing of war is just factually incorrect. Most people, including when they're asked, say that they're coming to the United States, for example, through the southern border, for a better life. And I would too, right? I would too. But countries need borders.
Okay. I was asking about a multipolar world, partly because I was just trying to think about, like, in a way it's that thing about remove yourself from the close-up and just think what the dream is. But also, in a way, I was slightly surprised that none of you, I don't think, slightly Cynthia with you, saw that the threat to the West, such as it is, comes from external factors. Although I would just challenge, you said the West is not in decline, and then you had an apocalyptic picture in your final 30 seconds. You blew the world up.
That's exactly what I said. That the idea that the West will go out with a whimper, this is the decline, there's no evidence of that. The Western values are declining, but the power of the West, I made the point that never before has so much power been invested in the hands of so few people in the West. So this is the
billionaires
position. Our values are going down.
The inequality is high.
Our power and wealth is going through the roof, and that is creating an inexorable path towards not a whimpering out, but towards either environmental catastrophe. You can see, COP28, COP29. We're not even talking about anymore. The Green Deal in Europe is gone. It's not funded anymore. Donald Trump comes out and says, drill, baby, drill. So we are heading towards a bang, not a whimpering out.
Okay, so if the question had been, is the West about to go, you would have said yes.
Well, no, about means that will happen tomorrow. It may happen in 20 years. It may happen in 40 years. It may happen in 15 years. But the question in this Holberg debate is about a steady decline. I don't see this in terms of our power and wealth.
I was momentarily reassured
as
you were presenting your thesis. Yes. And actually you end up in one of the most alarming places.
It's great to meet you.
Good. But like Konstantin and Cynthia, you also put it down to internal, the threats.
Of course. The crisis of 2008 was a crisis of capitalism, of Western capitalism. It wasn't a crisis that was concocted in Russia, in China, in the Islamic world. It was the result of this audacious recycling system, which was a very funny combination of balance and disequilibrium, very precarious, and at some point, because Wall Street was given this exorbitant power, effectively to print private money for the bankers, the whole thing came crashing down, and then our leaders decided to not to do what South Korea did in 1998 or what Sweden and Finland did in 1992, which is to save the banks but not the bankers. They decided to save the bankers by printing so much money that essentially you created huge asset price inflation for the rich, and you destroyed the prospects of the many with austerity.
You have done
that is internal crisis. It is a crisis which is endogenous, to put it in a quasi-scientific manner.
Okay, I just want to dive into something, though, about this sort of the potential external. There's quite a number of questions on this. One makes the point, you critique the global financial system, and on this question of the West's decline. Is the decline of the West really a decline of the global North, or is it more a matter of the global South gaining the space to assert alternative economic systems and values? Now, you didn't speak to that. But when you look at what's happening with the BRICS and with China and India, do you see that as, well, if not a threat to the West, a competition for space?
No, absolutely, absolutely. What is happening is this. Look, if you look at the United States economy, which is the only Western economy that really matters, it is now at around 50% of the industrial production of China, in dollar terms, not in PPP terms. So already, manufacturing in the United States has declined precipitously.
There was another B-29 around here.
The West, the global North, as you put it, is now shrinking in terms of global GDP. So you have the BRICS, you have Brazil, you have Russia, you have India, you have South Africa, you have also Indonesia, Malaysia. They are all absolutely peeved by the fact that even though their share of the global pie is increasing, they're all under the thumb of the Fed, of the Central Bank of the United States, in the sense that there is no payment that can take place around the world. A Malaysian cannot buy something from an Indonesian without this payment going somehow through the Fed. The Fed can stop a payment by an Indonesian to Malaysian. So they have this ambition of creating a parallel payment system, which is what the BRICS pays, and it's actually a very interesting thing. But that's not the same thing as a challenge to the US dollar, because the reason why BRICS is not going anywhere fast, even though it is an interesting experiment, is because China, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, they have not decided yet, to challenge the monopoly, the exorbitant power of the dollar. Why? Because if you're a Chinese capitalist, you make your money because of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. If you're selling aluminium to California, right, the United States is in a huge trade deficit. The only reason why they can buy aluminium from you is because they pay in the global currency, which is the dollar. So the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, has not decided yet whether they want to challenge the dominance of the dollar. Because don't forget, they have $3 to $4 trillion worth of savings, like you trying to undermine the bank in which you have your savings. But the way that the United States is persecuting this new Cold War, especially after Biden, with the CHIPS Act, effectively told Beijing you're not going to be allowed to have a technologically advanced country or economy.
Is that what it was?
The West is pushing, the United States is pushing the Chinese leadership to the point when they will turn BRICS into something that is substantial, like, for instance, a Bretton Woods with a one at its heart. But they have not decided that yet, because Chinese capitalists don't want it yet.
So when you look at the G20, you look at Saudi talking about joining the BRICS nations. I mean, I'm assuming people know Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Yes. You just think, listen, this is all overstated, that the G7 is still...
Of course it is. Look, the Saudis and the Emiratis, they think as follows. They saw that after the war in Ukraine, the Fed and, effectively the Fed, along with the European Central Bank that was mainly the Fed, essentially grabbed $400 billion of Russian central bank money. Okay? I'm not judging this, I'm just stating it. And if you are an Emirati, a sheikh, you know you're not the best person in the world. You know that you have an interesting track record. And you think, well, they don't like putting the Gokis money, maybe tomorrow they'll get mine. So if you have 100 billion, right? You put a couple of those billions through the Chinese one-denominated cloud finance system, the digital payment system of the Central Bank of China, you hedge a little bit. Washington sees this as a mortal danger to its hegemony, because it's not its industry and it's not its competitiveness that keep America hegemonic. It is the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. The only thing, and this is the delicious irony, that the only thing that really, the greatest ally of the power of the dollar is the Chinese Communist Party, which has not decided yet to challenge it. They can challenge it, but then they will have to be hegemonic around the BRICS. And the Communist Party of China, unlike the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, does not want to be hegemonic. They just want to sell stuff.
Okay, but we're focusing it, understandably, in terms of China and the US. But when you look at other nations, India, for example, and
they want to buy cheap Russian petrol, gas, oil, paying in rupees. Okay. And the BRICS pay system allows them to do that.
But would it be fair to say that there are people in the global south, let's call it the global south, who look towards the West, see the G7, see the UK and France sitting on the Permanent Security Council and think, this is not working for me?
Of course. Of course.
So do you think the UK and France should give up their seat on the...
Oh, I think it's preposterous that we have the relics of the Second World War representing, the international order. But nevertheless, what international order? We have an International Criminal Court.
I don't know why that
trashed
happens.
whenever one of our own bastards is indicted, but when the other people's side's bastards are indicted, we suddenly love it. We are such hypocrites.
Okay. Cynthia. In this multipolar world, do you think countries like France and the UK should be giving up their permanent seat to make it more democratic?
Well, I think we should at least reconsider the distribution of seats, distribution of power, especially because I think when you're looking at the kinds of things that security is affected by in terms of the information ecosystem, the scams, the AI technology that's used, the rapidity with which sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has moved to entirely mobile systems of banking and payment, right?
Yeah.
We're not there, right, in the West.
Close
so
to the
we're not
revolution,
even. We need to be keyed into how the rest of the world is engaging and preventing some of the, sextortion scams, for example, that are targeting teenage boys across the West. And leading to, I think, in our country, 36 suicides last year that originate from outside the US in the global south. Those kinds of, we have a different level of security kinds of things that have to address what the roots are and what's going on in those parts of the world as well.
Okay, but would you be better able to do these things, which I know you think are fundamental to society, if you opened the doors more to where the power resides?
I do think so.
Konstantin, you were shaking your head.
I think all this talk about the West giving up its seats on the UN Security Council. I mean, look, there are many...
I didn't say the West. I said the UK and France, which, are like middling, relatively, middling powers, let's say.
I think this is all insane. Utterly insane.
Isn't it logical?
No, it's not logical. I come back to what I said before. The world is a competitive place. It's a battle of civilizations. And ultimately,
it's a very bleak view of it.
Ultimately, somebody is going to be on top. And the choice is...
This is the bully theory.
Yanis,
ultimately...
I'm going to come back to you. You have got plenty of time.
No, I just wanted to be provocative.
Please, Yanis hasn't had enough talking time. Go ahead.
Please, Konstantin.
Somebody is going to be on top, and it's either going to be us, or it's going to be Russia, or it's going to be China. And if you want Chinese communist values to be the dominant ones in the world, be my guest. If you want Vladimir Putin's values to be the dominant ones in the world, be my guest. But I grew up in a society which had that. My family lived both in Russia and Ukraine, which are both suffering the effects of that. And I can tell you now, that would be the worst possible outcome for all of humanity.
But Konstantin, you are arguing a different point.
No, I'm not.
My question was around this idea of what happens to the power at the top, and I'm talking about the perfect example in a way is the UK and France having the right of veto. Now, isn't there a danger that the Security Council loses any credibility because it no longer represents what the real world looks like?
The UK is the 6th largest economy in the world. I don't know what we're talking about. We're a very powerful country in the world, hugely still, despite the decline that we're in, and we should cling on to that for as long as we possibly can, for the reason that I gave you, which is a world in which Western values are the strongest ones, is a much better world than whatever alternative would be conceived of or created if that didn't happen.
Okay, so the representation, and I mean, it's really to illustrate a point of what we've got: US, France and the UK sitting there, China, Russia. I miss Canada, possibly. Or, anyway.
No, they don't.
But that, you think, it's fine, we argue the case, leave it as it is. Yes. I mean, I suppose you could argue what value the UN Security Council has anyway.
Quite.
So, and this is something, I mean, the idea of the sort of how the world should be, I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that none of you really see so much of a great threat. So let's turn to the internal struggles. Konstantin, you talked about our civilization is better, and you made the point again. We're having this debate here in a university, and presumably the very reason for having the discussion is the West in decline, because everybody accepts that they want these values. Why do you fear the threat to that, like an internal threat? How great do you think that threat is?
Well, first of all, to address your question about external, internal threats, I don't see them as in any way separate. It doesn't matter what level of external threats you face. If you are stronger than them internally, you're going to be fine. All of that is ultimately based on whether you are capable, strong enough, confident enough, united enough, etc., to defend yourself against whatever is coming from the outside. It's always, these two things cannot be separated from each other. So the West losing its confidence, losing its ability to articulate its own values with confidence, losing its unitedness, using its identity in many ways, is a threat because it makes us more vulnerable to external challenge. Now, because I've been talking for so long, I've forgotten the second question that you asked.
Well, can I interrupt for just a second?
Of course.
Because I want to push you just a little bit on this confidence with which you assert the preference for a set of values that have never been applied universally internally, right? So is the solution then like this internal disruption around who gets access to those, to liberty, to freedom, to universal, whatever it is, whatever value. I mean, you could name the values. Whose free speech is challenged more than others, right? How do you justify, like, do you just paper that over?
I don't paper it over. What I say to that is a phrase that I wish more people used, that we use in Russia, which is everything is understood in comparison. Nobody is saying that the Western world is perfect. There are books and academics' careers and all sorts of accolades that can be achieved by chronicling, as Yanis very articulately did, about the evils of the West and its history. You can do that forever because every great civilization in history has committed things that we by our standards today consider evil, and in fact will be hypocritical in its own time too. But the question is, what is a better set of values? Does one exist? Now, to answer your question about, what are you alluding to, there is a phrase in America that I think answers your question very well: a more perfect union. No one suggests that the United States or the values of Western Europe are perfect. I would not suggest that even to this day all people in America are treated equally, whether that's on sex or race or whatever line. But which country has made more progress? We talk endlessly in the West about racism. Okay, what other great civilizations in the world are better at race relations than we are? Is it Russia? When I was last in Russia, there was a song playing on the metro, which was, they killed a Negro, la 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 la, he can't play basketball anymore. In China, one of the most popular commercials on TV was a Chinese girl who was approached by a black man. She pulls him off and shoves him into a washing machine. She puts the product that is being advertised into the washing machine. And what's the payoff? He comes out Chinese. Where is this great world to which we are comparing ourselves to? You cannot compare our civilization to utopia. You have to compare it to reality. And in reality, we are the best civilization in existence today, and that is why we must maintain our dominance around the world.
And no one seems to be arguing with that. Are we good enough?
I don't agree with that at all.
Okay.
Lots of people are arguing.
We'll come back to that. But are we good enough? I just want to...
We're never going to be good enough. Are you good enough? Am I good enough as a human being? Have I worked out the right way to treat my wife or my son so that I could say, I no longer need to improve. I am this perfect person.
Okay.
Is there any human being in the world who's not a psychopath who can make that claim? No. So why should we expect our civilization to be perfect? We should only expect it to be as perfect as it possibly can be and better than others. That's all that there is. Only comparison and nothing else. And if you're comparing us to the land of milk and honey, you are dangerous.
Okay, but I would agree there's a third thing. It's not just accepting that we're not perfect and that we're better than others, but actually actively working to improve the internal, which I'm not hearing you advocate for.
Well, you haven't asked me about it. I'm very happy to advocate it. We had this discussion, very briefly, we had this discussion over dinner last night about diversity and inclusion and all of these programs which are intended to bring people into the thing. And I say to all of that, the right objective, difficult as it is to achieve in any society, is that there should be zero discrimination against people. And what we have today in the modern West is a new framework of discrimination. We have decided that it is okay to discriminate against white people. It's okay to discriminate. Oh, you laugh. Well, let me give you some statistics. Fantastic, I enjoy that.
Before you give us some statistics.
No, let me give some statistics. If you are Jewish or Asian or white, it is much harder for you to get into an American university because all of those groups are widely discriminated against in that society.
That's simply untrue.
That is factually correct.
That is simply untrue.
For the same SAT score, you are much less likely to get in. The BBC has whole realms of jobs that are not available to white people. There are internships that prohibit white people from applying. Now, I don't regard myself as white. I'm a first-generation Russian, Ukrainian, Greek, Jewish immigrant. I hate this stuff, and I hate it because it unfairly privileges people who do not deserve the privilege. What we should be doing is eliminating discrimination, not introducing new types of discrimination.
Cynthia.
I think when you're born on first base and everybody else is trying to come up behind you. I was not born on first base. You already are.
How?
As a man. As a man compared to half of the population. You have advantages that are undeniable.
Really?
They are. And you know, you already are ahead of the curve in applications to things, in the way that resumes are reviewed. And so, you know,
I don't know about that. More women are in college now
being
than
perceived
men.
as white, even if you don't perceive yourself that way, in terms of how you're treated.
I was literally called a packy at school.
Okay.
How am I perceived as white?
Well, it depends on where you are in the world.
Right. So in my country, I was name called and discriminated against for being brown. So I have a privilege. You've decided by looking at me that I have privilege.
We all have female privilege on this panel. Everyone does. Everyone carries bits of it, right? I'm just saying, and I'm not saying that there aren't differences in admissions. I mean,
there are.
But those differences are also coming on the heels of widespread, well-acknowledged data. The SAT scores are
how
also
am I gonna
biased.
kill these?
That people live in really different racially segregated neighborhoods with different school experiences, where 15% of the kids in Washington, D.C. are unhoused, right, in the public school system.
So why don't we fix that instead of...
Exactly.
Well, I'm fully in favor of that, of course. What we should be doing is giving people an equal opportunity to succeed. What we're now doing is not giving people an opportunity to succeed and then saying, oh, you're black, let's give you a leg up into university. That doesn't work.
It's not a leg up. It's an acknowledgement that there are differences in the experiences of kids who grow up, let's say, in poverty. That from certain school districts, so I think that there's, yes, so invest the energy there.
We need huge government programs to fix that.
Create a little bit of space for Konstantin to set out what the consequences of this mind virus, well, actually the mind virus you applied to people thinking this, but the consequences of the discrimination that you see in place.
Well, it's the end of meritocracy. It's the end of meritocracy.
It never started. Meritocracy never began to end. There's never been meritocracy.
Okay, let me rephrase for the pedants.
Privilege.
Let me rephrase for the pedants.
And
it's the end of the pursuit of meritocracy as the goal. I agree with Cynthia. The United States Constitution, as written in its original
Positive discrimination
format,
is an attempt to create meritocracy.
a failed attempt, an attempt that promotes people who are not qualified.
But not trying is even more of a failure.
I did not say we should not try. I repeat for the third time.
Can I come in as an
It's difficult to
educator?
talk when you interrupt me every 3 words. I did not say we should not try. I think you heard me say twice now that we should be seeking to eliminate discrimination. I think I heard myself say that. So the problem with this agenda is that it ends the pursuit of meritocracy as the singular goal for which we should be striving, and instead reintroduces a new form of discrimination that advantages people not for their talents, not for their drive, not for their passion, but for the fact that they have a certain skin color, a certain set of genitals, or whatever else. It is completely antithetical to the goals of the West.
Right.
Spectacularly
Before you come in, I just want to ask one question so that we can narrow it down. Do you accept that in some environments, because just the nature of people responding to people who look or act like them, you end up with these sort of fairly, and it could be entirely black, it could be entirely white, it could be entirely gay. Do you recognize that
just
there is
wasted all that
to
energy.
almost kickstart the process so that you have a more diverse and fair group that's doing the picking? You don't even accept that?
Absolutely not. I don't think
under no circumstances.
I don't think there is any need to kickstart things. What there is a need to do is to make sure that people are not discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their sex or their sexuality.
Okay,
that's the need.
And if it's an entirely, let's use the historical example, well, it might be white male group or it could be black women doing the employment, and there is a record that they tend to employ like them. You don't think that some external force shoving them in a different direction
This
should
is
be
where
brought
meritocracy comes in. I am an employer. I run a YouTube channel which employs 10 people. It would never in a million years occur to me to employ somebody because of the color of their skin or their sex. Because I know that the only thing that matters is getting the very best person for that job. The very best person. And by the way, just so you know, we hired a woman to run the whole thing and she fired all the other women. So there you go.
Ooh.
Yanis.
This guy here.
I'd like to make a couple of
Probably
points.
a bunch of these.
One concerns this. Look, as an educator, many a time, in a class, there would be young people who, because of their disadvantaged background, needed more of my attention. Okay? Because of their disadvantaged background, they didn't have the same tools.
What if they were retarded?
Now, I gave them more attention, which meant, because it's a zero-sum game, there are a fixed number of hours every day, that attention, extra attention, I didn't give to other kids that were advantaged.
You should probably have hired
to call this
the
discrimination, because I didn't
talented
make
kids to
my
teach
time
the
available equally to
untalented
everyone,
kids.
is to miss out on the fact that in order to bring about meritocracy, in order to bring out the talents of the disadvantaged kids, and of course, disadvantage is highly correlated with gender, with races, with race, with ethnic background. To call this discriminatory in the pursuit of meritocracy is essentially to fly in the face of the facts. The second point I wanted to make,
very briefly, I did not.
Okay, you can come.
I did not call that discrimination. I was talking about admission. No,
when
I
we're
was
saying
talking about
in
admissions.
universities that
talking about
we are
admissions.
going to take people from a working class,
I was
and therefore
talking about admissions.
Okay,
admissions.
but I needed to make the second point because I think it's a question. It touches upon. It speaks to perhaps the deepest difference between Constantine and I. We have one commonality. We both grew up in a dictatorship.
Okay.
But a very different kind of dictatorship. He grew up in the Soviet Union. I grew up in a Greek fascist dictatorship under NATO. And I'm saying this because you have a tendency
Did you say under NATO?
in terms of us, the West, versus them.
Damn, was it really
and them
fascist?
being the East, being the uncivilized
Weren't you guys
Chinese,
fascist?
or the homicidal Russians, or the Africans, or who are trying to, to come to our shores. Because of my background, I have a very different tendency. You see, we were in Greece, when I was growing up, part of the West. We were part of the Council of Europe. We were part of NATO. And yet, the secret police broke down our door and abducted my father, and we lived in terror of a fascist dictatorship. So I know
that's why he hates NATO.
How to not see the world in us versus them. I can see, interestingly, my father, the same father, when the dictatorship fell, instructed me in no uncertain terms that I should study in Britain so that I wouldn't have to face the secret police. So I can relate to the importance and cherish the importance of Western values, while at the same time recognizing the dialectical relationship. It is the terror that the West has unleashed on so many other societies that has created existentialist threats for the United States, for us. So let us, just for a moment, consider the possibility that this us versus them, the West versus the rest, is the root problem.
I want to see it.
Which essentially condemns the West to the decline of the values, which may end up with a bang, not a whimper.
There she is.
Well, I apologize. Clearly, tonight I'm speaking very unclearly because everything I'm saying is being misheard and misrepresented. I never for one time said that the rest of the world was uncivilized. I never said that the Chinese were uncivilized. The Chinese civilization is one of the most ancient civilizations in human history. The Indian civilization is one of the most ancient civilizations in human history. The idea that I think Russia...
You said that our civilization is better.
It is better.
Don't mince your words now.
I am not mixing my words now. I'm
Hold on a second.
explaining to you exactly what I meant.
Our civilization is better.
No, it's not.
Well, quite. So
it really is not.
I hear you're going
the Arab civilization saved us from the Middle Ages through the translation process. We wouldn't have the ancient Greeks. We wouldn't have the Renaissance without the Arab civilization.
But did I ever say...
the Jews lived far better lives in the Ottoman Empire than they did in the West.
We're talking 2024. Where would you choose to be born today?
In the southern suburbs of Athens, where I come from. Because I'm a patriot.
Yeah, I would still be in the United States.
There you go.
Somewhere in the West, I haven't picked where yet.
I'm
waiting to see which part of it declines faster.
It's been a good conversation.
But the point
so
I'm trying to make is, when I talk about our civilization,
I think I'm going to wrap it up.
It's a comparative analysis, not
we're
chauvinism.
at the point.
I come from a different society. I don't see Russians as others. I see myself as Russian, and my values to some extent are still from that place, and I borrow from that, and I borrow also from my Western heritage by virtue of my growing up and being educated here. The point I'm trying to make is we have to compare to others, and I say to you, I would much rather live in a world where the West is dominant than the alternative. Now, what is the alternative? Many people who will tell you, well, the West is hypocritical. Yes, it is. The West has an evil history. Yes, it has. They will then not articulate what it is that they're looking forward to. And my argument is the multipolar world, which is being so prominently advertised to you as the end of our hypocrisy and the end of our evilness and the solution to all the terrible things that we have done, is an unstable structure which will result in the dominance of a different civilization, which will impose its values on the world. And the question that we should all be asking ourselves is, do we want that? Or do we want the West to continue to be the dominant force in the world? That is the choice. And anyone who tells you otherwise is either misleading you unintentionally or doing so deliberately.
Okay. We keep coming back to that point, and I suspect we will do so again, but I'm going to drag you both back to the point we were discussing
I think I'm going to end
about,
it here.
The striving for a meritocracy.
I think we've heard everything we need to hear.
And Cynthia, because you...
Varoufakis, I didn't know that his dad was abducted. I didn't know his dad was abducted by NATO police. I'm curious about that. He called NATO a fascist dictatorship. But I wonder how he felt about his own Greek fascist government at that point in history. But that was probably 20 years later. I don't know. I don't know how old Varoufakis is. He seems like 60. So it means he was probably born in '64, which would have been 20 years after Nazis had. I don't know. Let's see. What is the Greek relationship to the Nazis? I don't remember. Golden Dawn. That's 1980 to 2005. And I remember Dugan being a part of the Golden Dawn. Dugan, Golden Dawn. Correct, yeah. Kremlin connections of the Greek far right. 2009. Varoufakis. Let's go back to Russia's favorability decreased only by 1% to 62%, while the U.S. appeal dropped 5% to 34%. So the Greeks have always been, and that's so weird why they would be. Did we destroy their understanding of, I mean, ugh. Golden Dawn arrested leaders are openly endorsed by Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin remains in public correspondence with Golden Dawn's leader, Nicholas. But Varoufakis doesn't seem like a... Is Varoufakis a Nazi? No. Within a fortnight of Greece's finance minister, he has rocked up to the UK's Downing Street in a leather trench coat and electric blue shirt, redefined icy body language with the Dutch finance... Okay, whatever. Germany must be proud of the fact that Nazism has been eradicated here. But Varoufakis certainly did mention the war. But yeah, it is interesting that I'm sure, I guess, yeah, we are not Merkel's colony. Yeah, these are all Greek Nazi talking points. So it's really strange that he calls himself, but this is like the horseshoe theory, right? I mean, whatever. Something to look into later. I'm too bored now. Okay. You all be safe. Have a good time. We'll see you next time.